Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 24th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way that we keep this show on the air is by relying on the incredible support of individuals just like you. Usually, I read out the top patrons of the week. This week, I think I want to read out the top patrons of all time. If you would like to pledge a per episode donation, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. So my all-time top patrons include David J.E. Smith, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Jeffrey Sewell, Chuck Blell, David Compton, Juan Navarro, Juan Gutierrez, Pasquale Gelati, Joe Wilkinson, Ulrika Hagman, Howard, Doug Pettipier, and Mary Neva. Thank you all so much. You are amazing. You have kept us on air for, let's see, 543 episodes. Wow. So let's get into this 543rd episode. Today, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Rebecca Lemov. She's a historian of science at Harvard, and her research explores data, technology, and the history of human and behavioral sciences. And she has a new book out. It's called The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyperpersuasion. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Rebecca Lemov. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be with you.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyperpersuasion. But as I often do on the show, before we get into the content, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and how you got to the place where, this is content that you're doing a deep dive into. So you are a historian of science, a science historian at Harvard. Did you study history? Did you study science? Did you study both?
Actually, I come to my field, which is history of science, and it started at Harvard, so it's a kind of its own department, which is a rare thing in academia. It started in like the 1930s, but I wasn't specifically trained in it so much in history or history of science, but I came through anthropology and through what I often call a meandering path. And I got my PhD in a subfield called the anthropology of science. And that is related to history of science and the topic I ended up writing my dissertation about, which was a history of human engineering, social engineering, and the behavioral sciences, and exactly how much freedom or lack of freedom they could model in various behaviorist experiments. That was turned out to be relevant in this new field. So I was lucky to end up at Harvard and find myself in a sort of different discipline than I had anticipated.
Oh, I love this. And I'm a psychologist, so there's a lot of crossover there as well. Obviously, it's almost like you were doing history of psychology, but of course the behavioral sciences, they all, it's hard to tease them all apart.
No, there's a lot of history of psychology in there.
Oh, very cool. And so as an anthropologist, I can imagine that there's a lot of reinforcement of the fact that science does not happen in a vacuum. Science is done by people, and science reflects the zeitgeist. And so, in certain time periods, science was much more eugenicist in nature, or science was much more patriarchal in nature. I say time periods past as if that's that's all gone. So were these some of the frames that you would take as sort of like during this era, these were the social influences on scientific practice and inquiry?
Definitely. One way that my field describes what it does, you could say looking at context. So in the past, it used to be that historians of science were very interested in what they call internalist science. So that would be, sort of considering it almost in a vacuum. And that's kind of how the field started. People would do long studies of Galileo and translations of these experiments and not necessarily go into archives and things like that. But around the 70s and 80s, there arose a lot of interest in how even the questions that scientists ask are shaped by their concerns, and the science itself can also be molded by social conditions, because scientists are also human beings. So that was at times called the externalist approach. But more recently, I think historians of science like to think of what they're doing as one thing. So science is this process. I mean, one essential insight is that it's made by human beings. It's not static. It's not a foundation that never has to be altered, and it does respond to, and it's constituted by and continues to constitute the things around it. So sometimes people call it historical ontology and historical epistemology.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then we bring in philosophy. It's quite multidisciplinary.
It's a great field. I have to, take a moment to plug the field of history of science because it's genuinely interdisciplinary, and it's also just full of great stories. So if you have a philosophical bent, and if you're really interested in visuals or just thinking deeply about what it means to experiment with something or in some way, it's just a wonderful field because it's so interdisciplinary.
I also think it is like the best way to learn science, whether we're talking about astronomy or psychology or genetics or any individual field within science. It's one thing to say, these are things that we know. It's another thing to say, this is how we know what we know. And this is why what we know is constantly evolving with new discovery. And I think if we don't teach science from a historical perspective, we're really doing young scientists a disservice.
I completely agree with you. It's interesting. We have had a growing amount of interest from undergraduates, which is unusual. We're considered a social science at Harvard. But we're the only discipline for the undergraduates where you can actually get credit from the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. And we have tons of pre-med students and computer science students, but those who want to look at the implications and ethics and philosophy of what they're doing while they're doing it. So I think history is anything but irrelevant, but it does seem that increasingly just the word itself makes people think. Sometimes in wider society, the word history itself seems to mean like, I just wouldn't be interested in that, or that can't have anything to do with us today.
Like that's antiquated, that's dusty. Yeah. But it's not true. I actually wish that I had that opportunity as an undergrad. I studied psychology and philosophy as an undergrad, and then neurobiology in my master's before I went back for clinical psychology. And I did have the opportunity to take really interesting courses like the philosophy of natural science and the philosophy of psychology and the mind, which I think was obviously a different take, but still that multidisciplinary, like how do we know what we know and why do we know it? But I don't think we had these history of science courses. They were only within our departments, right? Like anybody who gets a psych degree takes a history and systems of psychology course, but that's just one class.
Yeah, a lot of the social sciences and natural sciences have an internalist, an internal departmental class where and it's often motivated. Like when I studied anthropology, it was the same way. There was a class like, this is how we got to be how we are. So it was sort of shaped by a kind of narrative. But history of science, it tries to be broader. And I think it would be, a lot of students just have never heard of it before they came to Harvard, and then they are happy to find it.
Yeah, quite rare. And of course, when we think of something like the history of science, like, wow, is that a broad, all-encompassing sort of umbrella? But you can't know everything, and you have your own areas of interest and inquiry. So tell me a little bit more. I mean, obviously, we're going to get to the concept of like brainwashing, but that's not the only area where you do research and where you teach, right? You're also interested in like technology, big data, animal and human studies. Like, how do you choose what you focus on?
No, I find that whole question really interesting. How do I choose these things, and what is the connection among them? But I do feel lucky that I can explore different areas of research. I'm also interested in psychedelics and human consciousness and different ways that has been understood over time. When I went to graduate school in anthropology, I actually had a background in English literature, but I thought anthropology went more to the heart of the kinds of questions that I wanted to answer in my life, which are, how do you know who you are? And would it be different, existentially different, if I was, raised in a different culture or speaking a different language or, in a different time. There just seemed to be some profound question that could be asked through anthropology as I understood it at the time. What does it mean to be a person? And also, to what extent are we shaped or free in the vast webs of conditioning that we all exist in? So I set out to explore that in two ways. First, I was going to study ethnobotany when I got to grad school, and I signed up with several famous ethnobotanists who, study the effects of plants on human beings. And then I also got interested in kind of critical theory and social theories and things like that. And I ended up having to choose between the two.
What about the topic of this book? Because this isn't your first book. You've done a few deep dives before, but your newest book, The Instability of Truth, what about this idea of sort of mind control, social control, persuasion, quote, brainwashing? How did you first get into that topic?
Actually, I will say that it would be accurate to say I got into it about 25 years ago, but I
Okay.
only looped back to it about 5 years ago during my last sabbatical, or 4 when I started writing. But I've really been teaching about it for many years. And I think it grew out of my dissertation, which, as I said, was about to what extent can human beings be controlled, and this kind of great dream of the modern social scientists and psychologists, behavioral scientists, to create a kind of something like what Aldous Huxley describes in Brave New World, a system that would be inescapable and would mold society in an efficient manner, but ultimately not necessarily to the benefit of individual human beings. So I ended my dissertation with a chapter on brainwashing, less than a chapter, but an inquiry into it. And then my first book, it's called World as Laboratory, has a chapter on brainwashing, because I thought brainwashing brings together these questions in an extremely piercing way. It really deeply asks the question of whether you can be deprived. How much can be stripped away from the human being? Can you become somebody else against your will or with a certain amount of acquiescence? So one of the mottos of the early brainwashing research was, taken from the experiences of Cardinal Mindszenty, who is one of the first people who was publicly put on the world stage, having been arrested by Hungarian police, put through 28 days of some sort of procedures, and then thrown before the cameras. And he seemed like a zombie. And he said later, without knowing what had happened to me, I had become another person. And what had happened to him was some combination of sleep deprivation, some physical brutality, but it wasn't essentially about brutality. I mean, he had been a war hero. He was a revered figure in his country, and he was made to crawl around on his hands and knees and wear a clown costume and eat his food off the floor, and he was possibly drugged. But within this relatively short time of 28 days, he became someone else, as he described it, and he looked ashen. And this seemed to announce to the world that the communists had some sort of super weapon. And I thought it also posed to me this idea of, could you become another person? Could you be transformed against your will? Or to what extent would one participate in that process? Seemed like an interesting question to me.
And did you see that more as like a personality shift or a induced sort of mental illness?
I wanted to know more about what it would be.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really like a conversion. And I think one of the mistakes we make is to think that conversions are permanent. It's a sort of a motivated conversion and a motivated self-transformation, but that human beings seem to be capable of. It has a psychological dimension, but I don't see it as essentially psychological, but really existential. I mean, the case of Patty Hearst is a good one, in which she said something like, I can describe it in more detail what she went through, but she said at a certain point she had to decide. She said, I learned to accommodate my thoughts to coincide with theirs. In other words, she had to think herself into being another person if she decided she wanted to survive the experience of being abducted, raped, and subjected to thought reform.
It's interesting. It's almost like a very twisted form of empathy that was required of her.
Exactly. It is a pragmatically motivated form of extreme empathy. And I mean, would go under the incorrect name of Stockholm Syndrome too. But, I mean, there are many problems with that paradigm, but I think that does describe some of the dynamics.
Let's start there then. Let's talk a little bit about Patty Hearst, because I think it's interesting that you mentioned her early on. I think a lot of people have heard the name. Some people know the story in detail. Some people are like, Hearst, right? Like, press magnate. Like, I think I know something about her. So maybe you can give just that quick and dirty background, and then we can dig into that grappling with the concept of, quote, Stockholm Syndrome.
Sure, that would be great. Not great for her. So she was a 19-year-old sophomore at UC Berkeley, and she had grown up nearby in California. She was a granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, who's portrayed in the famous movie, forgetting the name of it. Anyway, a magnate of American newspaper empires, and her father also was the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and she was one of 3 daughters, I think, who grew up in prosperous circumstances. But when she went to UC Berkeley and she was living with her fiancé, she was targeted by a revolutionary group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, that was headed by a man who was, until recently, he had been a petty criminal named Sinkyu, but or Donald DeFreeze, he recreated himself as the leader of an anti-racist revolutionary army, and he recruited a set of former students and mostly women to follow him. And they began by executing the commissioner of the Oakland Public Schools, because even though he was African American, they felt that the kind of tracking system they were using in the Oakland schools were dangerous to students. So anyway, they had a kind of mix of paramilitary style and highly idealistic leftist beliefs. So they basically decided that as a righteous action, they would arrest Patty Hearst, by which they meant kidnap her from her apartment. They beat her boyfriend over the head and left him unconscious. They shoved her in the trunk of a car. They held her in a closet for 70-something days. When she wasn't able to see the light, she was blindfolded perpetually. She was taken to the bathroom, a couple of times a day, but even then she wasn't allowed to see anything. She was read propagandistic. She was read things like Mao's Red Book and other tracts by some of the members of this party. And she was made to make these broadcasts that were sent on cassette tapes to the local radio stations. And meanwhile, her parents, who were pretty wealthy, were asked to feed some, send welfare or grocery. I guess they sent a huge grocery truck out to feed the residents of Oakland and other cities in California. So, and they were basically it became a huge press circus that she had been kidnapped. It became a kind of media-driven event. And to make a long story short, she was asked to sleep with like the leader of this group and other male members of the group. She agreed because she said that was the only way to save her life. She said that later. At the time, she said she really, at some point, she decided she wanted to survive and she would do what was necessary to try to make that happen. And after the 70-something days, there was this kind of ritual moment where she was asked, "Do you want to join our group?" And she knew at that moment, as heavily armed as they were, that if she said, "No, I'd like to go back to my parents or go home," that they would kill her because it would be such a violation. So she said yes. She ended up, therefore, she had to, enthusiastically, she said, "I didn't just have to unwillingly go along. I had to become a member of this group." So she sort of summoned up that enthusiasm. She ended up robbing a bank holding a machine gun. She was captured on the internal videotape robbing the bank. She didn't shoot the weapon or anything, but she said later in the trial that she was coerced, of course, and that she was terrified.
That's like that famous photo that everybody kind of references when they think of Patty Hearst. That's the photo you think of, right? Her with these, I guess it's an automatic or a semi-automatic weapon.
Exactly, and it decorated thousands of dorm rooms and it became an icon of a certain kind of celebrating leftist organizations without, I guess, fully understanding the circumstances that caused her to be there. I mean, it's a really astounding story, but basically her group then went on the lam. They relocated to Southern California. They were in LA. The FBI and LA police and other forces basically instigated the largest firefight in California history. And the SLA was heavily armed as well. So something like 6,000 rounds of ammunition were exchanged on a public street in Southern California. And the whole safe house where they were hiding, that group of Patty Hearst's abductors were hiding, was immolated. Several of the members were mostly burned alive, and one of them was trying to protect their pet cat while this happened. So everyone assumed that Patty Hearst was among the dead. And it happened on live television, which was unusual also. As it happened, had gone out on an errand the day before that had gone terribly wrong, and so she wasn't in the house when it burned. But the Attorney General of California said, she's just a common criminal now, so she may be dead or alive, but it doesn't really concern us. So, however, she did survive because she was on this ill-fated errand, and she ended up, I won't go into the details of that, but she ended up going on the lam and was finally arrested about a year and a half later, at which time she said they asked her to declare what her occupation was, and she said urban guerrilla. And so, at that time, so fairly soon thereafter, the main experts who had specialized in understanding the brainwashed troops from the Korean War 20 years before were then all called into the case, and they all ended up testifying in her defense that she had been brainwashed in this massive trial in 1976. And she lost that. That argument did not stand up in court. And for various reasons, the prosecution was successful in arguing that even though they even toured the closets in which she had been held, but they sort of implied that even if she hadn't chosen to be kidnapped, she had secretly wanted to be, and that she was, I think in the prosecution words, ripe for the plucking. And that it was somehow this spawned and that she had agreed to the rapes because she considered one of them her boyfriend, and that she in a sense had hijacked them because she was one, and many Americans identified her as kind of like their kids who seemed to be running amok.
Right. So there was a lot about the culture and the fear and sort of the mass panic, but there was probably also a lot of like sexism that went into this sort of jury decision as well.
Unfortunately, even today that persists. I mean, Jeffrey Toobin,
yeah,
who's not known for his he wrote a long book about Patty Hearst called American Heiress, but in an interview, he also called her a willing bandit, even today, saying that, and most people, even when polled recently in 2014, said she should be held responsible for her crimes, because it's kind of this idea that she was on a wild ride, like a spree, and that somehow the events that could be discarded. So, and she herself felt so despairing that she thought that nobody would ever understand what had happened to her. And she sort of turned out to be correct.
How long was she involved from the time she was first kidnapped up until she was captured on the lam?
I think it was a period of about a year and a half.
Okay. And then how long until, was she immediately, it seems to be, at least from my understanding of folks who are in cults, that there is this, it's not overnight that you just go, oh my gosh, look at what happened to me. Oh my gosh, like, yeah, I didn't, this was all against my will. And this was all like, there's this period of sort of like deprogramming that people have to go through. Was she immediately sort of saying the same thing about her experience, like I was a victim, or did it take her a while to sort of come to understand that?
No, in fact, she never said that. And especially initially, she just exhibited great confusion and physical distress. I mean, she had lost so much weight. Her lung collapsed one day. She almost died. She was also being targeted. There were two other surviving members of the group, and she was being targeted as a traitor. And, there were even assassination attempts that she might be killed in jail because she had not been loyal to the SLA. and they still had allies. And those who examined her, the Korean War brainwashing experts like Margaret Singer, who was an expert in giving projective tests and Rorschach tests, and they did full examinations of her. And Singer said she described her as a low IQ zombie. She said she had lost 40 points of IQ in the, at the point that she was tested, which was right after she was recovered. But I think it's a process, and I've observed this too in talking to former cult members, that there's often a period of, and it can be an extended period of great confusion, and also, in a sense, even nostalgia or yearning for the certainties that these groups provide, this kind of sense of meaningfulness. I don't know that Patty Hearst has ever said she felt she missed in the group at all, but many other people have testified that even children born into cults who are raised in them and who are brought out by the FBI or things like that, often do find a great deal of confusion in constituting a new self and finding some sort of meaningful structure.
Of course. I mean, it's all they knew, right? What an important component of this. Like we mentioned cults, we mentioned the Korean War victims, we mentioned Patty Hearst. There are obviously components of all of these experiences that are different and that are unique, but there is so much similarity. And that's really, I guess, sort of the point of all of this, right? This idea of brainwashing and mind control and persuasion is that these are some, I guess, examples that are known examples of times when individuals experience that kind of mental and physical pressure. And I think they would all benefit, for example, from similar types of psychotherapeutic intervention after the fact, right? This sort of like work towards understanding what was traumatic, work towards understanding that they weren't at fault, and how they were victimized, and working on developing an identity again. There's so much here. There's a huge difference, though, between somebody who's like born into something, right, and somebody who comes to it later. So let's talk about that idea of, quote, Stockholm syndrome and where it comes from, and what some of your concerns are about the terminology.
The idea is that Stockholm syndrome, which comes from a case of a bank robbery in Stockholm in 1977, in which the people who were held hostage seemed to develop strange or bewildering sympathies for their kidnappers or for the bank robbers. This is often applied to young women who are abducted and made to held for long periods of time. And Patty Hearst was held for a pretty long period of time. And when she was arrested, they found in her purse a little piece of jewelry that one of her abductors had given her. And they used that in court against her to say she truly loved him. She was a victim
This
of
is
Stockholm
so
syndrome.
like classic blaming women. Like,
I
it's
know.
so insane, the mental gymnastics that it takes to understand that if somebody is fearing for their life and their safety, that they're going to do anything they have to do to not be raped, killed, tortured.
This goes to the heart of the Stockholm syndrome critique. And
Right.
yeah, because Patty Hearst said, they got nicer every day they didn't kill me.
Yeah.
Like that, could you be more clear? But she also said, I knew nobody would understand. And it was actually true. Most people,
It's so
it's
sad.
pretty rare, and it's painful. Like, even if you look back in her history, when she was 15 or 16, she had a crush on her math teacher at a private school in California. He said she was just hanging around all the time. What could I do?
Yeah, of course.
She
Always
was after
blaming
me.
women for men's
He's
behaviors.
like, I
Yeah.
had no defense. And then he ended up seducing her and then saying she had done it. And then they actually were engaged to be married when this whole thing happened.
Wow.
But it's like an interesting Stephen Weed, but she never spoke to him again afterwards that I know. But he wrote this book where he tried to acquit himself.
Ugh. I mean, and this goes back to like, obviously we see it in a lot of religious rhetoric, like women, you have to dress more modestly because men can't help themselves and you're asking for it. And it's just such a common refrain. And I believe that what we end up with is an entire society of girls who then become women feeling not only responsible for their own behaviors and actions, but responsible for the behaviors and actions of men. And so they're constantly having to police everything they do and say in an effort to protect men's egos and protect themselves from the ramifications of unchecked egos of men. And it's a really exhausting existence.
That's well put. I mean,
but we see in these extreme, right? Because every girl and woman on the planet is experiencing that from day to day. But these are extreme examples where somebody is violently victimized, and then, whether it's the court of public opinion or an actual judicial hearing, they are somehow blamed for their own victimization.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, within the group and outside the group, sometimes it was imagined that Patty Hearst was the mastermind, or that she had secretly somehow convened them just due to her powers. And with Stockholm syndrome, or what's called Stockholm syndrome, I mean, I think the reason that people who have had these terrible things happen to them say they, I think it was a 14-year-old girl who was abducted from her bedroom, taken for years by this crazy Mormon couple or ex-Mormons, but basically made to bear children, all sorts of things. I mean, it's almost as if you're blamed for having chosen to live.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, but there is going to be a psychological process, right? There is going to be a form of identity development that occurs if you are mothering children over the course of several years. And then all of a sudden you're rescued. You are going to have emotional ties and bonds to the children you mothered, to the environment that you were in, even if it's deeply fraught and complex. It's not going to be so easy to just go, oh, good, I'm saved. That part of my life is now behind me.
Exactly.
I shall move forward and be the identity that I had before I was kidnapped when I was 14 years old.
Exactly. So it's not about going back to some identity, but really forging a new one that is, as healthy as possible. One of the most profound experiences in researching this book was that I went to a meeting of the International Cultic Studies Association, where they were focusing that year on survivors of sexual abuse in cults. And there were there was a whole set of kids, former kids, they were now in their early 20s to late 20s, who had been part of the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, which was an extremely abusive cult where it used certain aspects of Christianity, but it was really this charismatic, or purportedly charismatic and alcoholic leader who had, he would take control of the girls and he would sexually abuse them, and the boys were physically abused too, beaten constantly. And
isn't that like what it always is too? I feel like every cult documentary I watch, every time I read about whether it's a religious cult or a philosophical cult or a yoga cult, or it doesn't matter, it ends up being like one male charismatic leader who uses his power to get rich and to either coercively, via like rape and abuse, or via, I don't know, deep brainwashing, have sex, and oftentimes have sex with minors. I mean, it's disgusting. It's so common.
It's so common. Often there can be female lieutenants or mid-level managers who are male or female. That gender breakdown is common, or that you described, although it can be other ways. And that's something I got interested in, is like, if there are good people, there are often good people who are drawn into cults. They tend to be more idealistic and maybe more open, sometimes super intelligent. And they just get drawn in because they actually get convinced that maybe a better world is possible, or maybe, and there are positives that accrue, because otherwise no one would ever stay there.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's also why I think you see them so much, like here where I live in LA. Like you see them on the West Coast a lot, like California, Oregon, Washington. We're sort of like cult central because it's a very liberal, very open, very idealistic. And yes, I do think there's some inherent vulnerability in certain individuals, but anybody can be brainwashed, right?
It can be, I consider it to be a potential of anyone, and it can be situational. It can also just be circumstantial. You happen to be walking down this street rather than that. You chose this teacher, this yoga center, this whatever. That's why I brought myself into the book, just to show that we are all subject to this possibility. One thing I got interested. So when I heard these second generation kids who had been born into the Alamo cult, and they were taken out by the FBI in raids because of the extent and the deep abuse that they were subject to as kids. But they also said that was traumatizing because they were wrenched away from their parents, from everything they knew, and they had been trained to fear that, militarized troops of the US government. So it wasn't consoling to them. And they were left on the other side, with this almost impossible task. They talk about the pseudo self as this kind of cult self that arises where it has to be constantly reinforced, often by repetition or phrases that people continually return to, and very regulated types of behavior. But once you're out, it's hard to see what that will be replaced by. And that's why there's often periods of, sometimes people join other organizations or get sucked into other systems, or are just extremely confused, or
like they date like high control partners, or these patterns because there's a safety and a comfort, especially when you're born into something like that. I mean, I can imagine that it was very similar for the well, for any child, but I'm from Texas, and I can't help but think about the sort of Branch Davidian, like Waco standoff, and how just botched the FBI response was to that, and the ATF response was to that, and so many people died, and also so many children who were ultimately rescued were separated from their parents, and I can just the trauma of the experience is probably exacerbated by the trauma of the intervention early on.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that I try to bring out in the book is just the threading through of trauma and this persistent way that it's unrecognized in the whole history of brainwashing, that constantly drawing on, feeding into, and produced through people's sort of repositories of unprocessed suffering and vulnerabilities, and produces further trauma. But somehow, even in the early years, it was never meant, never associated with trauma. But even today, when we seem to see trauma everywhere, it's strangely invisible sometimes. Like when you hear about someone who was brainwashed or got out of a cult or was in a scam, I think each of our instincts is often like, why, how could they have fallen for that? They must be, there's something wrong with them, or here's where I would never have fallen for that.
Right. Always. Yeah. Always easier said than done. One thing we didn't do, I want to sort of take a hard left and then come back. But one thing we didn't do is actually define the term brainwashing. I think most people just sort of know it when they hear it. But is there an accepted definition? Is it even a technical, legal, scholarly term, or is it sort of a colloquialism?
Well, the way I address this is a very good question. I address it the simple answer I would give is that the most the most useful synonym that's a little more technical than brainwashing is coercive persuasion, which reminds us that brainwashing it's not simply a matter of sheer coercion or torture, or as in Pulp Fiction, getting medieval on your ass. It's not just simply forcing somebody to do something they don't want to do, but it involves persuasion, and it involves a certain amount of buy-in or agreement, even if it's just to save your own life. It gets into really tricky territory because it tends to hide in some of those areas. And one thing that the history of brainwashing, what I choose to do is follow the word itself into the English language and show the very vibrant, the way that it takes hold suddenly in 1950 when it's introduced. And then that's how it's never really, it is used by scientists, but they often quickly substitute a more technical synonym, such as forceful interrogation is one way to talk about coercive persuasion, or sometimes a Dutch psychiatrist talked about menticide, the death of the mind, or legally the phrase undue influence is sometimes more successful. And one of the lessons that I learned from my research is that brainwashing itself it just never holds up in court, except in the case of the Manson family. If it's used to attack or sort of prosecute people, it can hold up. But because the girls who carried out those murders were argued to have been brainwashed, but also responsible for their actions.
Right. So it's not ever been a very good defense, but it's
never exculpatory, but it also is shameful. Like, it's almost always shameful. Anyone who's associated with brainwashing is sort of a pariah in a sense.
Which is so heartbreaking because again, I can't help but keep going back to this, term victim blaming and this idea of undue influence. It's interesting you say that. I literally this week just took my licensing exam and so much on the ethics portion, with the American Psychological Association and also so many other sort of medical or clinical fields. Undue influence is such an important form of maleficence, right? Like it is harmful. And so you're always thinking about that when you're thinking about protecting the public, when you're thinking about ensuring that your patients are, that you're making decisions in their best interest. So dual relationships and all of those things. It's like, no, if there's ever undue influence, we are not supposed to engage in those things because we're in a position of power.
Exactly. It shifts the emphasis to the person in power and also by implication responsibility, whereas brainwashing is kind of a queasy term because it does bring in this kind of the confusing relationship there that is just hard for people to understand. And in recent cases with cult leaders that have been successful legally, either undue influence or even just interstate trafficking, or is more successful as an actual way to get people behind bars.
I see that a lot with federal prosecutions where either trafficking in human beings or financial crime seems to be a more
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say an easier, but a stronger case.
It's so much stronger because
Sadly.
it's cleaner. If you
Yeah.
can follow the money, you can make that case. It's interesting because I think that when you bring in relationships, people just get lawyers are people too, juries are people too. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that it's, if you could just settle the question of brainwashing by providing some definitions, you wouldn't need to. But it actually, the more, I've been studying it for decades, and the more I study it, the deeper I feel that it gets, and the more questions I have.
Well, and I can't help but want to sort of shift over. I'm thinking almost like a dialectic or like a continuum. And on one, let's say, extreme side, you've got torture during the Third Reich, or you've got like these examples that we have, like Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, and then in the middle, maybe you have these quote charismatic leaders who are very coercive and preying on individuals who are either vulnerable or not. And then over here on the other side, I'm thinking about things like, I don't know, Fox News, like this sort of cultural phenomenon that a lot of people will talk about where they're like, I lost my father to Fox News. Or like when a media or social circle becomes so incredibly narrow and so propagandized that it shifts the way that we start thinking. Is that not also a form of brainwashing?
Yeah, I argue that it is. I think that any kind of siloed environment, and our media is extremely fragmented right now and destabilized. That's why I called the book The Instability of Truth, not the end of truth or something like that, but just that we live in a moment where so many previously reliable, or you kind of knew where you stood, maybe a little bit more, are so fragmented and set back. So you can easily find yourself in an informational. One of the classic ways that brainwashing was defined was by Robert J. Lifton, who wrote in 1962. He defined 8 different qualities of thought reform or brainwashing, and he would also end up studying extreme situations like Nazi experiments. But he said of those 8, the primary one is milieu control, and that involves controlling the information that comes into an environment and goes out. So, in a cult, you're, especially before the internet, but even including digitally driven cults, the information to which you're exposed is highly regulated, and that's one reason that members of cults are often taught thought stopping, or they're taught to repeat certain phrases just so there won't be room for other things to come in.
Yeah, and they're taught to isolate themselves, right, from, like, family members or from those with dissenting opinion. I even think about, I was born Mormon, so I grew up in the
Mm.
Mormon church. I left when I was 15, and I know that legally it's not a cult, it's a religion. But
Mhm.
I can't help but like that is a demarcation problem of the highest degree, right? Like it is very difficult, that line between a cult and a religion, or even just a social kind of group. But one of the things I think about, and it seems silly, but okay, like you don't watch R-rated movies if you're in the Mormon church. Well, why don't you watch R-rated movies? The argument is, oh, for moral purity, to avoid any sort of, whatever, exposure to something that could be detrimental to your, morality. Really, I think it's to keep you in a closed environment. And there are all those small things. We don't do this, we don't do that, we don't talk to these people, we don't watch these kinds of things. Well, that closes your world. And the smaller your world, the easier it is for you to be influenced by the people who hold power in that small world.
Very true. I mean, I think that's one reason that cult. Well, so the technical definition of a cult, or the simplest definition, the basic definition, is just a small religious group that hasn't yet become institutionalized yet. Cult scholars or anti-cult scholars do sometimes often, argue that certain large-scale religions are cults or cult-like, and some of the main ones they talk about are Mormonism and Catholicism, just because sometimes they have cultures of abuse or just highly scripted, a kind of sheltering effect.
Scientology.
Yes, and yeah. But then one interesting thing is that the main anti-cult groups in their history have never been able to maintain an a reliable list of what is and what isn't an abusive cult or just a cult, because I mean, on the one hand, they were just getting sued. The Scientology and other places have very active lawyers, and they also recruited scholars to to kind of attack them. But on the other hand, it is difficult because one person's experience, because of the limit cases. So, there are the big five that seem to be obviously cults, but even so, there are people who dip into Scientology and maybe they feel invigorated by it and their lives aren't ruined. And so it's hard to say what, absolutely.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Like my father, who converted to the religion, he was not born into it. I was born into it, but he was not. He is a dyed in the wool true believer. It is only good in his life. He does not see anything negative about it. And he is definitely not a Patty Hearst figure.
Mm,
Like he is a willing participant. He
yes.
has, yes, they make it kind of hard to leave, like because of the blame and shame, but you can leave. I left when I was 15. I pulled it off. And so it's very hard, that wiggly line of like, it's cult like, but is it a cult? Is it, is it undue influence? At what point does a teacher have undue influence? Like at what point does that, I mean, I guess that's why this is such a difficult conversation to have.
I mean, it's heartbreaking too, because a lot of times there are certain people who are almost like sacrificial figures within the group.
Hmm.
Like I have been doing yoga for 35 years. And when I guess I was doing it in Oakland when I was a grad student, and my boyfriend at the time came by to pick me up after class, and he's like, wow, that looks like a cult to me.
Yeah.
It looks like everybody's sleeping with everybody else. And I was like, that's ridiculous. But it's absurd. But it turned out to be true. Or at
Right.
least
Have you read
had
about
the
Bikram and have you read about
I mean, I thought this was an exception, and this is always the case because
Right.
cults actually often operate especially sexually abusive or extractive, or even physically abusive. They're often identify the other group as cult-like, and that
Hmm.
it actually adds to the absurdity of the idea that you're in a cult. So it makes it harder to identify. But it turned out the teacher was actually sleeping with bunch of different students, and there were many ways that it was it was extremely damaging for them, and I think that dynamic really struck me.
It makes me wonder, and I mean, obviously, this is probably not something that you dig too deeply into, but this is a political question as well as a question about coercion. But does ultimate power ultimately corrupt, or are these more corrupted people seeking these positions of power? Where is the chicken and the egg of it all?
Right. I think it's a process, and
Mm-hmm.
probably someone who understands narcissism better, like maybe I'm not trained in psychology, and maybe you would know better than I, but I do think that the position of cult leader does seem to be corrupting. If you even look at Jim Jones, like he certainly didn't start out as the same megalomaniac he was by the end, although there were issues from the start.
Right. Or even like David Koresh didn't seem to be like, he had his ideas, but there definitely seemed to be a change over the course of I don't know, you're right. But then you got people like Trump. I said it, you didn't. But you got people like Trump who you knew the motivation from day one. There has been, you look at old interviews from 20, 30 years ago, he is the same person he's been. He had the same intentions. He had the same, I can't diagnose him with narcissistic personality disorder. I don't know him. You can't diagnose somebody you've never met. But I think there's a lot of consensus view that there are some intense personality concerns there. So yeah, you've got people who are already like that, who are just seeking power. And then there is that thing that happens to a lot of our politicians where once they get into power, they start making morally ambiguous choices. And then the more that you make those choices, the easier it is to keep making them, just kind of like being caught in the snowball of a lie.
Yeah, I think there is a snowballing. I think there's also something I think I've noticed is cult leaders become jealous of their followers because their followers are the ones who get to experience when there is undiluted joy, ecstasy, and these kinds of group experiences. The leaders are, in a way, left out of it.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, they're sort of punishing. And they also know it's a scam. Like many of them, on some level, they know that, or they know a lot of things that are hidden from others. So they also come to resent their followers because they're the ones having a true experience when there is that. And so that leads to more punishment.
Ooh, it's almost like when husbands get jealous of their children. It's a bad dynamic.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, is a podcast about scientific skepticism. And, we teach critical thinking skills and learn how to root out pseudoscience. And we often talk less about cult leaders, although we do talk about them, and more about sort of like charlatans and snake oil salesmen and scammers. This fundamental question of is that person a true believer, or is that person an abject charlatan? Do they know that they're peddling woo, or are they buying what they're selling? And oftentimes we land at the end of that argument on it actually doesn't matter what the motivation is, because ultimately people are harmed regardless. But I wonder if that is something that you often grapple with.
I do think that's an interesting question. I am haunted by or interested in this line, something that one of the subjects who was studied by Robert J. Lifton said, and he wasn't a cult leader, but he was a French physician who had been working in China and who was a bit of a megalomaniac in his personal life in relation to his family, but nonetheless, he was an effective physician and he lived in China. He was told to evacuate the country when the revolution came, but he didn't want to, and he thought they would never arrest him because he was doing such good work. But he did get arrested, and he was subjected to extremely brutal re-education in a Maoist struggle group. And at the end, because he was chained, bleeding, he had to eat off of the floor, and even when he slept at night, he was accused of imperialist expansion because he was taking up so much space. And he ultimately succumbed to and confessed to these, crimes that he had never committed of being a spy. But when he emerged, he was still so paranoid, and he was talking to Dr. Lifton, a psychiatrist, and he said, "It's a special kind of belief." He said, I see how it looks to you, but I also see the truth that I had to embrace when I was in there, where he was a spy. He had to see himself as a betrayer of the Chinese, of the people. And he said, I like this thought about a special kind of belief. It's a highly motivated belief, but we're capable of these things, and maybe not at the same decibel level that Dr. Vincent had to adopt.
Maybe, though, we've never been in that situation. And that's the thing, right? I think about Milgram's experiments. I think about these ideas of the Third Reich and how many just everyday citizens just fully ignored what was happening in their backyard. How many people joined the party simply to save their own skin. And eventually, you have enough cognitive dissonance, you have to pick one, and you're going to pick the one that causes the least harm to you. Maybe. Maybe you have the moral fortitude to pick the one that causes the least harm to the most vulnerable. But very often, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You're going to pick the rock or the hard place.
Yeah, so I think that phrase, "it's a special kind of belief," was revealing. I also think the Milgram experiments are extremely eloquent. I often think about them because it was pivotal in my experience when I saw them. But I think that what's interesting about them that's not fully understood is that you're actually watching someone being tortured, but it's not the person you think.
Oh, it's the person who's pushing the button. It's
the
not the
person
person
who's, yeah,
pretending to scream in the other room. Yeah.
exactly. And Milgram himself commented on it. He said, "I watched a middle-aged man walk in, confident of himself and the world, and he came out a sweaty mess, because he had been undergone these circumstances." But when people watch it, I don't think we often see that.
Yeah, we just think, "Oh, what a monster. How could they have done that?" And it's like, you're missing the point. The point is you could easily be the monster too, right? Because the coercion itself is traumatic. Like, and
And it's sort of hidden.
yeah. And this decision making to say, "Oh, I'm going to do a bad thing right now because I feel like I have to." Now, the why do you feel like you have to? That's a different question. But there's just so much there. And I think about, these soldiers at Gitmo, and I think about these individuals who very often probably don't walk into something expecting to make these kinds of decisions, but there's so many psychological processes at play: groupthink, loss of individualism and individual identity, and this tendency towards violence when we observe it and when we're caught up in it. It's super scary, but I don't know. I don't want to call it the human condition because I do think we can make decisions that are better than it. But if we don't have insight, right? If we don't have the neuropsychological humility to recognize our own mental shortcomings and to recognize cognitive biases and these different heuristics, we're always going to fall victim to them. So is that the solution here? Is the solution to learn about these things and read about these things? Is that what will inoculate us?
I think so. Two things. I mean, one is that I discovered in the archives of Robert J. Lifton, who was the first to really articulate, the psychodynamics of thought reform, kind of hidden this cassette tape he recorded in 1973 at a seminar where he makes a kind of argument along the lines of what you're just describing. And he talks about 9 types of numbing or narcotization to which all of us are potentially involved in. And it went from acute numbing, which he said would be someone going through the bombing of Hiroshima, and chronic numbing, which would be someone who works in a Nazi death camp. And he studied Nazi doctors. He spoke to them. He's one of the great psychological historians of the 20th century. And then he said, but it ranges also to technological distancing. It ranges to what we would call the narcotization of ideas. And he says, and even just ordinary adulthood is subject to this type of dissociate. And he said that these are all connected. And I think that the thing that I found remarkable about brainwashing is that we want to separate them and say, over there is where the terrible things happened. But what I'm choosing in this moment with my Instagram or my channel, my silo, what I'm exposing myself to is very low stakes. I mean, and that to try to see that they're all connected. Like when I looked at the hard cases, they were also made up of ordinary moments, just the conditions that people found themselves in. So I do think that this kind of awareness that we're all in this, we're all subject to these things is, for me, has been very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I will make the implicit explicit. I said it, you didn't. But, my father, if I had talked to him 15 years ago and described the current president and described what was happening during the current administration and said, do you promote these things? Would you vote for somebody who wanted these things? Is this the state of democracy that you're looking forward to? He would not say yes. It would be in direct contradiction to the teachings of his religion. But did he vote for this man? And is he continuing to double down on this? Of course he is. And that, I believe, is because of exactly what we've been talking about. There are leaders within his religious groups and within his political groups that are telling him this is the right way. And it's too threatening to think outside of that box because it would undermine his entire identity at this point.
Yeah, that certainly, I see that seems accurate to me. I think also perhaps just we're at such a moment of extremes where I heard one political consultant say, I mean, had the other side won, 60% of the population would have had to be deprogrammed or something like that. I mean, I think that it's interesting to think about what could be useful. And I don't know how this relates to how you and your dad interact, but I wonder, I've been playing with the idea that brainwashing, when used to describe other people, is less useful than if it's used as a kind of reflective lens.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are my experiences and what are my inoculations against those experiences? Where are my vulnerabilities and where are things that I don't even recognize? And it's why it's important, I think, to not only read the news article, yes, I stick with my silos too. It's important to read things that are outside of our silos. It's important to talk to people who disagree with us and not talk to them just in an effort to make our, arguments stronger, but really listen to where they're coming from and try and understand it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's so much good stuff here. I've already kept you so much longer than I said I would. Is there anything? I mean, obviously, there's a million things we left out, but is there anything really important that we left out that you want to make sure is said before we wrap up?
No, I think I really enjoyed talking with you. There's so much more because it relates to so many things, but I feel like that was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Good. It's such an important topic. Again, there is so much more, and that's why I love doing these interviews on Talk Nerdy, because we're not reading the book to you. We're not diving into every example. The whole point is that there is so much more. So everybody, the book is The Instability of Truth: Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper-Persuasion by Dr. Rebecca Lemov. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much, Cara. It was great to talk with you.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.